Thank you. Yes, we ask that you please leave the room unless you want to become part of the demo with us, but that's a whole nother story. So we have a disclaimer sign to sign. So I'm Jonathan Butts. This is my colleague Billy Rios, and we're going to talk today about some research that's been going on for a couple of years, and about 18 months to be exact. And we're going to go over some interesting thoughts, and some of it's going to be from the technical standpoint, a lot of the technical details on this, but we're also going to tell the story of what we've had to deal with going through trying to work with the manufacturer and to get some of these issues solved. And so kind of an interesting thread we're going to bring out throughout the presentation.
And we have 2 live demos. And if both demos actually work, we're going to go straight to the craps table after.
Right to the craps table. So we'll be there. So Billy, let's go ahead and...
Yeah, I'm Billy. I've been a couple different places. I think the kind of key takeaway from this slide is actually know what it's like to be on the engineering side. I was at Microsoft for a little while. I ran security for Internet Explorer. So I definitely know what it's like to wake up one day and find your product on CNN, not in a good way. But medical device is actually a passion of ours. We've done a lot of work in the medical device community, and that's actually how we got started, kind of working on systems together.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, I'm Jonathan Butts, and one of the things I'd like to highlight is I retired from the Air Force. I was a professor at their graduate school, and so when we talk about research, cybersecurity research, we actually make sure we put that vigor, that academic background and vigor in it. So we're actually doing it from an experimental standpoint. And so when we provide the results, either to vendors or other folks, we want to make sure that it's sound and repeatable, to follow those research principles. And I think that's important for what we go through here as we present today. These aren't just things we discovered and said, hey, this sounds interesting, we're going to draw these conclusions. These are actually, we follow a very strict methodology.
Yeah, hey, there's a man been doing cybersecurity for a long time, even when everyone hated that word cyber. That seems like everyone's using it now. But there's a lot of folks who may not do like device security or something like that, but have definitely influenced the way that we look at problems, right? So, I mean, I'm sure I'm forgetting someone here. If you think you should be on this slide, definitely let me know. But we definitely wanted to take some time to recognize a lot of different folks from the industry. And then the next slide actually talks about specifically like medical device researchers. So if this slide makes its way to the public and someone's interested in like, hey, I want to know some folks that actually do medical device stuff, this is a list of some really good folks on here. Stephanie, Jay, Kevin, Jeremy Richards, Scott, Peter Morgan, and Barnaby. Man, that guy was like light years ahead of his time, right? So I think some of the stuff that we're going to do today may actually even overlap with some of the stuff he did in the past. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second, but the work that guy has done is just amazing. So.
All right, so when we talk about vulnerabilities, we want to make sure that we call out to a very important distinction between what we see on traditional information technology systems. Your traditional IT systems, a lot of times you put that in the context of your information assurance principles, the triad, confidentiality, integrity, availability. That's all fine and dandy, but when we're talking about medical devices, really what we're interested in is patient safety. How does this vulnerability that we find, does that impact the delivery of patient therapy? And that's really the important question. That's the question we should be asking is, does this impact patient therapy at all? So from this standpoint, one thing we do want to call out is we're not physicians. We are cybersecurity researchers. And so our role is to present the findings from a device level and not to make the call on whether or not it's a risk to a patient on whether or not they should or should not be using this device. That's up to the physician and discussions with the physicians, as well as integration with FDA to start making those calls. And I think too often cyber researchers will kind of reach on that. So from this standpoint, our point of view is the benefits with implanted devices, they're used to save lives. And so at this point, we still believe that the risk of not having it it's better to have the medical device because it outweighs the risk of the cybersecurity aspect.
Definitely. Yeah.
Good.
With that said, there are cybersecurity vulnerabilities in a lot of different products, right? So that's just a fact of life. We all have to deal with that. And so that's not something that I think we can change anytime soon. However, the way that we deal with those issues is something that we can control. So we're going to spend the first part of this talk talking a little bit about disclosure. This is not research that we did yesterday, right? It's not like we just discovered this stuff yesterday and then just decided to come present here. This has been a long journey for us. A lot of this journey that we've been going down over the last 18, 20 months is captured in these 4 ICS cert advisories. Those are advisories from DHS. There's the links to them, and then really are captured by these 9 CVEs. So if you want to reference these or look up public information about this, that's captured in these documents.
And so the research we've done, we found vulnerabilities or security concerns in 4 of the major manufacturers of ICD or pacemaker devices, implantable devices. And so we reported those to the major vendors. What was interesting for us is there was one manufacturer that actually was very difficult to work with. Now, Billy and I have been doing this for a long time. We have together probably over 500 advisories that we've reported through ICS Cert and worked with vendors. And for the most part, vendors are cooperative, right? They see you as free QC, QA, and they'll work with you. And we're patient with vendors from that standpoint because the end goal is we want to see these devices fixed. Motivationally, we use our own money to buy these devices. We're not paid by any clients. We don't have a financial interest in any of these companies. This is something we find passionate, and we want to help, move the ball just a little bit forward. So one company that we're going to kind of go through this process here, for some reason, it was very difficult. And so we want to kind of share that story along with the technical findings, just to kind of highlight some of the frustrations as a researcher. And for some of the other vendors out there, I think it's a good example, classic example of how not to handle it. Coordinated disclosure with researchers. And remember that term coordinated, that means coordinated both ways.
Right. Yeah.
If you're the vendor, you can't just say I'm using coordinated disclosure if you're ignoring the researcher.
Right. Yeah, pretty frustrating experience. Probably one of the most frustrating experiences ever been down. We just want to give you a little bit of insight as to kind of what went down here. So as far as the highlights go, one of the initial issues that we reported could potentially be used to hurt or kill all patients utilizing a particular implanted device. That's a pretty serious potential, right? That's a pretty serious upper limit to the impact of a vulnerability. And so when you're talking about a potential like that, we, hopefully reasonably, would expect that a manufacturer that we give research to where the potential is that high would probably take that seriously, right? I think they have a responsibility to take that seriously. As of this moment, we found out that there's actually one patch from the vendor. It actually has nothing to do with patient safety, which is kind of disappointing. More about data. We'll talk about that one here in a second. Some of the issues that we report to them, like a directory traversal bug in their update infrastructure, took 18 months to reproduce. So we gave them a report that outlined a number of bugs, all kind of stemming on like a web directory traversal vulnerability, like 18 months for them to say, we finally reproduce in our environment, right? So that's unacceptable. The safety analysis didn't include some pretty obvious vectors. We're going to talk about that here in a second. And at some point in time, we're encountering questions like, do you know how hard it is to find a Solaris 8 install disk? And we're like, oh man, it took 15 seconds on Google, right, to find an ISO. And then we're like, hey, you probably shouldn't be running Solaris 8 on your update infrastructure anyway, right? So,
so kind of to reiterate, this is the takeaway for us, right? The rest of that stuff's interesting, but from a vendor's perspective, we reported something that has the potential to hurt, kill patients, and they've spent more time twisting the story, or at least trying to put out a message from our perspective, instead of fixing this problem.
Right.
We actually provided them how to fix it. Their competitors have actually implemented security controls to protect against this, and probably for what, $20,000?
Yeah, engineer time, cost stuff, probably all together.
Instead, here we are today.
Right,
so here's some of the trust issues we've gone through. So this is one of the vulnerability highlights from the advisories from ICS Cert.
Yeah, this is a classic example of the lack of variant analysis, right? So we gave them a report that talked about some weaknesses in authentication mechanisms, and then the proof of concept that we had demonstrated a capture replay attack. And so if you actually go to the advisory that's associated with this, if you look at the risk section, it talks about, hey, the device is vulnerable to capture replay attack. That's not the full extent of it, right? We don't actually need to capture anything. We know what the structure of the message looks like. We know how authentication occurs. Authentication occurs with a serial number. The serial number, the first couple digits of the serial numbers are all the same from the programmers that we've seen. And so really you're just brute forcing like 5 numbers, right? That's not a very good space. And so this is an example though, like, hey, we shouldn't expect a researcher to literally develop a proof of concept for every feasible scenario that's possible, right? We shouldn't have to do that. Instead, what we should do is say, hey, look, these are the weaknesses that we discovered. Here's a proof of concept that we've developed that takes advantage of one of these vectors. And as the manufacturer, you probably know your product better than anyone else. You should be able to understand what the variants are, right? And if you're going to publish an advisory, the advisory shouldn't be focused on the one specific scenario that the researcher reported to you. You probably have a responsibility to understand what the total impact of a vulnerability or a weakness is. So this is an interesting one as well. Like we have this in red and highlighted in red. Additionally, attacker with access to a set of these credentials and additional identifiers can upload invalid data to the CareLink network. Does anyone really understand what that means? Probably not, because it's worded that way intentionally. How about I just break it down for you very simply? We had a vulnerability where we could literally upload data on behalf of another patient. Right? So you're in bed, you have a patient monitor on your home and your bedstand. That thing's reporting information back to the doctor about what's going on inside of you. And we could just join a network and upload data, say, hey, you're not doing so well, or maybe you're doing fine, right? And so this is another example of, hey, if you're expecting folks to make a risk-based decision on the vulnerabilities that are affecting your product, you should probably give them the right data, right? I understand there's a brand piece to this. I understand that there's other things, other factors, political decisions and things that you have to understand. But at the end of the day, it's all really about your patients and the physicians that are taking care of them. And we want the physicians to be able to understand what the real risks are so they can make an informed decision, right? Here's more examples. So, I mean, we just read how a vulnerability is exploited on the last slide here. Every single advisory contains this sentence in there. These vulnerabilities are not exploitable remotely. So go back to the last slide. It's like, but somehow, even though this is not exploitable remotely, someone can upload data somewhere to a network, right? It doesn't make any sense. And so what we went through was a couple months of essentially just dissection of like, hey, yeah, oh, we did server-side updates. And we're like, how is this not remotely exploitable? One of the things we're going to show you is via radio. And they're like, oh, that's not exploitable remotely. You got to be close, right? You got to have some. It's like, look, man, if it's a network-based exploit, it's a radio-based exploit. I think most reasonable people would call it remote, right?
If I can do it from Starbucks.
Right? If you can upload invalid data, like via Starbucks to their network, it's probably remote, right? So, but I don't know why this is in every single advisory, right? And then at some point you just get tired of fighting the PR spin, right? It's just like, man, it's just not worth it anymore. Say whatever you want to say, and we're going to come to a place, thankfully, like Black Hat, and just show what we've discovered. And then you can decide with your own eyes whether it's remote, right, or low risk. So,
and I think the other piece for frustration for us is it buries the message.
Definitely.
We're so wrapped around remote, not remote. It's like there's potential impact to patient safety out there. And that message is lost because we're too busy focusing on characterizing these correctly. So here's another article that came out, and the company actually said that in the article that, hey, the patients weren't at risk, and even quoted that said, it did not affect patient safety. Well, fast forward up to right before this talk yesterday, when news started leaking about what we were going to be presenting on. And now they said yesterday, they released it yesterday, the security bulletin was dated 27th, but there's sufficiently low residual risk to patients' harm.
Yeah,
Words matter, right? Is it none or is it low? We're not talking about something that doesn't really matter. We're talking about risk to patient safety. Is it low or is it none? That matters to me. Right. If I'm a physician and have to make decisions off this, that should matter. And this is what we went through, is like the verbiage changed almost every phone call we tried to have with them, every messaging. And it basically led us to believe is they don't really care about the impacts of what these devices have. That's what they showed to us. Now, I find that hard to believe, and I don't want to label everybody at a single company that way, but that was just the message that was portrayed to us. So, yeah, we're going to get into now a couple of the different devices themselves. We have two devices that we're going to demo here. We, due to time constraints, we decided to stick to two. So go ahead and.
Yeah, hey, so I want to talk to you about how these insulin pump systems work. I think there's been some research on this in the past, but I just want to do a quick primer. So essentially what you have is what's called a meter, right? And that's this thing right here. And that meter, as you can see in the screenshot here, would actually be connected to something that could actually be implanted inside your body, right? So a little bit difficult to take apart, right? And then at some point, what you would need is this thing would actually control the amount of medicine that you're getting getting in a controlled way, right? That's what the meter is there for. In some instances, what you might be able to do is actually control that yourself and deliver medicine when you need it. So how do we get one of these things? There's actually a lot of auction websites out there where you can actually buy these things, right? In some cases, you might need a prescription. It might be good to have a friend who can say, yeah, get it, give it to them. But in most cases, when someone asks, hey, what are you using this for? What do you need this for? Whatever, we just respond to either over email or phone. It's like, hey, we just want to take a look at this. We think they're cool.
They asked if I was a doctor. They didn't ask if I was a medical doctor.
Right.
So it's well, yeah, I'm a doctor. Right?
I think my favorite response was like, I think my favorite response was like, whatever Billy wants, I approve. And the manufacturer's like, it kind of doesn't work that way. So, but it is possible to get these things, obviously. This is the one that we have. And so some of the radio considerations, this thing broadcasts on 418 megahertz. It uses on-off keying for essentially transmitting data from the little programmer to the actual meter, right? And then it's a single channel operation. Essentially what happens is there's an insulin pump remote programmer that you can actually turn on and say, hey, look, if I push a button on this little programmer, it can actually deliver medicine or insulin, a bolus, what they call, into someone's body. Right? It's pretty important. That's done via clear text protocol, right? Authentication is accomplished by what we call synchronizing. There's actually a button that's like called like synchronize, right? And then you actually program the serial number into the device itself. And so the device, when the radio piece is turned on, it just listens for signals. And if it has the right serial number at the header of the message, it just takes that message and processes it, almost like a serial bus, right? So, so this is obviously susceptible to spoofing and replay, right? That includes bolus. And so if you capture the signals in the air, this is what it looks like, right? So this is what a captured synchronization message would look like, right? And this is what you would have to essentially do to initiate the pump in order to take some kind of message to do some action. And then if you take another message for the actual bolus, this is what it would look like as well. And then if you actually break that down into the bits and bytes, like demodulate it, you'll see that it's a very simple message that gets passed. And the way the authentication is done is via serial number at the very front. So if someone is able to guess your serial number, if someone listens in the air and captures your serial number, or if someone just brute forces the 5 digits that change for the different programmers, they will be able to guess what the serial number is, and they will be able to initiate synchronization and bolus or the stopping of delivery of medicine on a pump if you have the radio mechanisms turned on. So we're going to demo this for you here. Can you turn this guy on here? I'll show you what this thing looks like. So we have this meter right here. We have a program around here somewhere, but more importantly, I have a hack RF like sitting right next to it. So we're going to be broadcasting over low power. And to be honest, the message that we're going to broadcast has this device's serial number, or the programmer that's programmed to hear the serial number. So it shouldn't affect anyone else. But man, if you have a radio device that's especially one of these, I would back away, probably leave, man, because these things do some weird stuff, right? And some stuff that we can't explain.
So again, back to the point as Billy sets this up is remote, not remote. This is his laptop connected to an RF device. We're not connected through any physical cabling at all to that device. Again, definition by me is remote from that standpoint.
Yeah, and then let's see. You might be able to see this.
I don't know if you can hear it. It'll start going.
Yeah, just give it a second. We'll start going about now here. I mean, I wouldn't classify this as remote. I mean, look how close it is, right? I mean, come on, right? So, but I think the important thing here is that we actually changed this demo last night, right? We stayed up pretty late last night to change this demo. The original demo that we had delivered bolus, right? Like dumped insulin in someone. This one actually stops the delivery of insulin. Does anyone know why we did that? Because if you read the advisory, the risk is like, hey, this attack can be used to deliver bolus. So it just talks about the one scenario that we showed in the proof of concept. We're like, it goes well beyond that, right? Whatever the remote programmer can do, we can do that. So if the remote programmer can stop the delivery of medicine, we can do that too. If the remote programmer can update settings on the device, we can do that too. If the remote programmer can deliver bolus insulin to someone when it's not supposed to, we can do that too, right? And so if you go read the advisory, it just talks about one scenario, right? Go read the advisory, see. And that's why we changed this, right? Because when we see things like that, it's frustrating, right? It's like, do we really have to do proof of concepts for every single scenario that's possible? I don't think that's reasonable, right? I'm gonna go to the next one.
All right, so the next, we can switch back to the slides. Or do you want to?
No.
All right. So that's the one piece of it. The second device that we talked about, which actually probably gets more attention just because it seems a little bit more nefarious, I guess, or impactful, is the pacemaker and ICD systems. And so kind of just how these things work. They're actually implanted underneath your skin. There's some leads that are put into and there's one right there. And there's some leads that are put in, and it'll control the pacing of the heart. The ICDs will actually, with certain circumstances are met or parameters are met, it will actually initiate a shock to regenerate the heart beating. But the important part of this is this whole thing is an ecosystem. Yeah. It's a system of systems ecosystem. And so the way these are set up within the patient's home on the bottom left there, you actually have a patient monitoring system. And most of these, they sit at the nightstand. The device communicates to that usually at night when the patient's sleeping, because it's gathering data and sending it up through the network over to a patient care network. That way the manufacturer can monitor it, but more importantly, the physician can get indicators for that patient. Another part of the ecosystem is the actual programmer itself. And that's sitting at the clinic, and that's what the physicians will use to actually program the therapy that goes into the pacemakers. And so that it's done over an RF communication. They will program when it's supposed to shock, what the pacing algorithm is, and a whole set of parameters for that patient. Then the back end piece of it, which is also part of this ecosystem, is the SDN, or the software delivery network. So this is where updates are actually pushed down to these devices, or from the perspective of the patient care network, which is also back on the manufacturer, where that data is brought in.
Yeah, another important thing to understand is that these programmers, so what you're looking at right here, so what you see in the top left-hand corner on the slides, that's this, right? This is a physician programmer. These things also have the by design capability to update the firmware on the device itself. So not only is there a program on the pacemaker or ICD that says this is what the pacing cadence should be, this is the criteria to deliver a shock to get someone's heart started, this thing also has a software on it as well, right? And not only can this programmer adjust the therapy that you're getting, it can also change the software on the device by design. That's by design, right?
So when we look at these, the actual programmer themselves, the various devices. So if you look at the radio communications, and this is what some of the past research has alluded to, you can target a single patient, and that's almost like the demo we just gave here, is you can target a single patient using RF.
Right.
And so that's kind of the one-to-one scenario, as we would cause it, is I can launch an attack against one specific individual. So if we look at the home monitoring station, if I go to someone's house or I target that specific home monitoring system, I can do a one-to-one attack. The programming is a little different. It's kind of one to multiple, just because that programmer sits in a physician's office or an operating room or clinical setting, and those devices will program multiple ICDs. Yeah. So those programmers might be responsible for a dozen, 100 more, and there's about, what, 10,000 of these, I believe?
There's tens of thousands across the world. Yeah. This specific programmer
that are actually used to program the devices, and this is for this vendor. This is the model they have right now. There's not a newer model. The software is up to date, current patch to the current patch level.
Yeah, these are the most interesting attacks, though. So there's a mechanism, a communications path from these devices through the internet to servers that are basically internet facing. We'll show you how that works exactly. And there's a software delivery network and a patient care network. If someone were to exploit these components in its current situation, this is where you can attack every patient, right? Because you would have access to update software on a home monitor. You would have access to update software on the programmer. And if you have access to a programmer, you can influence the software on the programmer. What can you do? You can by design change therapy, and you can by design change software on the actual pacemaker or ICD, right? So when you look at the threat model, you know, the radio-based exploits are really cool. We love doing them. The attacks against the actual programmer itself and the attacks against the actual home monitors, really cool. We love doing that too. We have lots of vulns in those things. But the communications path between these devices and this infrastructure over here is the most important piece. Because if any part of this gets compromised, the potential for every single one of your patients to get hurt or killed is present, right? I'm not saying every vulnerability allows that, but if someone compromises your software delivery network and you don't have the right mechanisms in play, they will be able to leverage that to influence every single programmer in the field, right? And if they can influence every programmer in the field, they can reprogram the therapy and the software on every single device in the field, right? So these parts are the most risky parts of the threat model. So if you're a vendor and you develop these things and someone starts reporting vulnerabilities in your software delivery network, you should probably take it pretty seriously, right? And so what we're going to do is just kind of give you an example of how this works, right? So we have a programmer like this. The programmer uses RF to actually interact with the ICD or the CRT because this is inside someone's body, right? You can't hook up a USB port to it, anything like that. So that's done by radio. So you have to be in pretty close proximity to get access to that communication stream. Go to the next slide. And then there's this internet component and there's a software delivery network. So actually, how does this work in the real world? So go one more. What this programmer will actually do is when it's ready to download software updates, it will actually establish a VPN to the software delivery network. And then once that's done, it will actually pull software updates down, right? So at a high level, that's essentially how the updates occur. So to the next slide. And so if you really want to take a look at one of these, you can go to various auction websites and just buy one, right? This one's in excellent condition. And then if you manage to, let's say, get a shell on a device and kind of monitor what happens after the VPN is established, this is what you'll see. You'll see 2 network adapters. One network adapter will be on your local network or wherever it's connected to, and the second network adapter, which is a traditional commercial off-the-shelf VPN client, establishes a connection to an internal software delivery network belonging to the manufacturer with its own IPs and own gateways and things like that. And so like I said before, programmer utilize a VPN client to join the software delivery network. The endpoint for the software delivery network is actually on the internet. That is an internet-facing server, right? So when this thing downloads software updates, it is connecting to an internet-facing server to establish a VPN and then downloading the update once it's on the other internal software delivery network. The programmer automatically passes credentials from the programmer to the VPN client in order to join the VPN. So the doctor doesn't type in a password, nothing like that. It automatically does that, right? And then after the VPN is established, the programmer will download the software update. And then what does it do? It executes it, right? And so there's some interesting observations here. And this is what we actually reported to the manufacturer 550 days ago.
More than 550.
Yeah, we said, hey, we know how your software update mechanism works, right? There's this VPN thing. It's kind of interesting. You use some really, I don't want to say ghetto, really interesting software called Marimba, right? So it's actually end of life. It's not supported anymore. There's 2 sets of credentials that are used to essentially initiate this download process. One set of credentials to join the VPN, one set of credentials to authenticate to the update server. We've got both of those. The software updates are not signed. So if anything ever happens to the update server and they serve back an update, the programmer's going to run it, right? And the software updates are actually requested over HTTP. So, I mean, is it HTTP that's secure or HTTPS? I can't remember.
I don't know. There's
one of those. Right?
S has an extra letter.
I always forget, right? Yeah. So, and so this is what we're looking at, right? This would be the endpoint for the VPN on the internet, right? Pretty interesting. And since we can see the actual configuration for the VPN client, we can figure out how to connect to it. One problem, the password's not in the VPN client configuration. The password for this is actually stored in non-volatile memory on the programmer. Kind of a neat trick. No one would ever look there, right? So, but when,
text,
right, yeah, so we start to reverse engineer some of the way that this works, and we realize if you take a look at this IDA disassembly, at some point in time, the username and password get passed to the VPN client via the command line. Pretty interesting, right? So what we ended up doing is writing our own VPN client saying, hey, you know what? Instead of just logging into the VPN, why don't you just log this password to a text file, which is what we did. And so now we can authenticate to the software delivery network. Once we're inside the software delivery network, we need another set of credentials to actually authenticate to the update server, right?
Base 64.
And there's the credentials right there, right? So base 64, no one would ever guess that, right? I mean, it's uncrackable, right? So, and then also what's in there is the actual host name for the update server on the internal network, right? So, and that's what the internal software delivery network server looks like. And so not only did we get access to it, we could see all the updates. If you take a really close look, we can actually see updates that are not even supposed to be in the public, right? There's some updates in there called investigational, right? Those are parts of trials, clinical trials, right? So, but there's a lot of stuff there. What are these files? Does anyone know what these files are? They're executables and MSIs. The operating system for this programmer is x86. It's a really modern operating system. Windows XP.
Windows XP.
It just came out maybe last year or something like that. So developing malware for this program is pretty straightforward, right? x86 Windows XP. And so we're in the SDN. We can see the update infrastructure. We can observe how the updates are delivered to programmers. But you know what? It's not like we can just start going and attacking their production server. So
because it's so protected.
I mean, it's super secure, but
because we don't want to cross that legal boundary, right? So we can't get into their system and hack it because then we become instead of obvious criminals.
What you can do though is see how the requests are done and see what the server header that gets returned is, and see exactly what version of software they're running on their server, right? This is the exact version of Marimba they were running in 2016 when we actually did this research, right? Like right before Christmas. I'm sure the wives were happy. Yeah. But so now we know the exact version that's running the server-side software, right? And so what do? We go get the software and install it in our own lab, right? So now what you're seeing here is like burp requests that are being sent to a 192 address, which is actually our internal lab. And then once we did that, we started to realize that the server software that they're using isn't really that good, right? It's got some pretty obvious issues, like say, for example, directory traversal issue that allows you to retrieve like any file off of the web server, right? And then here's another example, not just text files, but binary files too, right? So we're running this against our own infrastructure in our own lab, right? So this is what we reported to them.
This is the fun part, yeah. So we started in January, and let them know there's weaknesses in potential security vulnerabilities that will allow I guess, a nefarious actor to actually go into the SDN and potentially serve malicious software firmware up to their Windows XP programmers. So the timeline, once we talked with them and communicated with them, week one, good conversation. They had the engineers on the phone, and they're setting up a test environment based off our document. And again, we provided a research document to them that provided step-by-step details on what we found and how they could reproduce it. So understandable. So this moving forward through week 8. All right. So 2 months. Okay, we're still a little patient there. Okay, we go through week 15. Finally, at the 100-day mark, we notify ICS CERT and also FDA to let them know that, hey, there's a potential vulnerability here. We've tried coordinated disclosure with the vendor. We're not getting really much of a response, so we're doing our job. We're throwing it over to you. So this was, again, back in January is where we started. So 100 days, that's where we ended up there. One of the things from the FDA post-market guidance, which I think has actually been a good thing for helping move the security along, if there's unacceptable residual risk to patient harm, what manufacturers should do is they should consider the exploitability of the vulnerability and the severity of patient harm if exploited. So that's when we talk about the disclosure timeline of how vendors are supposed to responsibly act to tell their patients. If you got more to add.
No, I think it's good. No.
Okay, so with this, at 30 days, the manufacturer communicates with its customers. Again, at the 100-day mark, we were still being told that they're setting up a testing environment. There was no notification. And actually, in reality, there was no notification at all until we started talking about presenting at Black Hat. Funny thing. 60 days. The manufacturer is supposed to help by then fix the vulnerability if there's a potential impact to patient safety. So at the 5-month mark for us now, we had another conference call with the manufacturer. This time the regulator was on the phone, and they.
Not this one.
This was I'm sorry. Yes. So at 5 months, they said there are no patient safety implications. So they said we actually reproduced your research, and there's no patient safety implications.
Yeah. Yeah, so we were like, man, that's kind of interesting. We have some questions about what your analysis looked like, right? And so one of the things they said is, hey, the directory that serves the software is read-only, right? No one could ever write to that directory. Like, oh, okay, that's pretty interesting, right? So we go to the next one. And so we're like, okay, that's cool. And so we're like, okay, if that's what you say, that's what you say. And then 3 months later, we had another call. And this call was with us, the vendor, and DHS and FDA. Right, so the regulator's on there and the U.S. government's on there, and basically they're telling the company like, "Hey, no patient safety implications here," right? And so we thought that was kind of interesting. So go to the next slide here. So we started asking some questions, right? We're like, "Hey, look, we reported directory traversal vulnerability, kind of interesting vulnerability. Understand how maybe someone couldn't use this to own the server, but we're wondering if you went through these test cases. Like, for example, each programmer authenticates to the server, right? They all have a set of VPN credentials and a web server credential. Where are those credentials stored? Are they stored in a file? Can this directory traversal vulnerability be used to access that file? Is it an htaccess file? Is it a database file? Could we download that file, right? So could we get passwords for other programmers?
Legitimate questions you would expect the vendor engineer team and the vendor to ask of themselves.
Right, definitely, yeah. And this is their answer, like crickets, right? Like, man, nothing, right? So, and then so we said, hey, we have this Marimba server. It's got administrative features. That's kind of neat, right? The administrator credential is actually stored in a base64 hash in a configuration file. We know where that configuration file is. If you have a directory server or directory traversal vulnerability, could you retrieve that Marimba configuration file and actually get the admin password and then get access to the administrative features on Marimba?
Yeah, nothing.
Well, crickets, right? It's like, well, okay, all right then. If someone did retrieve the admin credentials from Arumba, would they be able to authenticate as an admin? And if so, could they just simply change the directory where the files are being served from, right? Crickets, right? So I love Cricket, by the way, but I mean, man, this is tough, right? And so at some point, though, the truth was revealed, right? So we said, hey, also, given that you're using Solaris 8 for your software delivery network servers, is there any type of like method that someone could use privilege escalation? So even if you lock down the directory, Solaris 8's pretty old. I think it's end of life. Have you given any consideration to the fact that you're running end-of-life software and someone might be able to run a privilege escalation exploit against this Solaris 8 installation? And the answer was, no, we didn't. And we said, why not? And they said, because we actually didn't ever reproduce any of your research, right? This is 8 months later.
After we had a call with the regulators and DHS, to where they told them there are no patient safety research. So our frustrations, again, I know we're a little frustrated up here, but this is ridiculous. Come on.
Yeah.
You know.
Crazy, right? So 2 months later, they're like, oh, hey, you know what? We did actually replicate your findings, but hey, there's no patient safety implications, right? So there was actually an advisory that went out for some of these bugs. And when that advisory went out, someone actually wrote this article, right? We'll come back to this article here in a second. So not comfortable testing intra-SDN, right? So we can't really prove or disprove that specific attack scenario. But to be honest, even if their analysis is true, 10 months of analysis time is probably too long, especially considering that the impact, if that server does get compromised, is what? Every patient could have their therapy altered, right? So, and it seems like they put forth little effort to kind of understand all the various implications. So, want to talk about this one?
Yeah, and so one of the things that, again, we were working with FDA on this, and we've reported, as we mentioned, plenty of vulnerabilities before. Working with the vendors is something we actually enjoy. This has just been so painful. But working with the FDA, kind of one of the things that they have for leaning forward with is this analysis board that they're standing up. And so part of this is to help avoid issues like this. And this is going to be the part where they actually have researchers and physicians, clinicians across the industry that will help vet these problems. Because that's one of the issues is you have the vendor saying one thing, you have the researcher saying another.
We're both vested.
We're both vested in one way or another. And so how does the regulator weed through this to actually make sure they're making smart decisions? And more importantly, the one thing missing out of all this whole thing we did, there's no physicians ever involved in the discussions, right? There's no doctors. There's cyber researchers and the vendor. And so how do we pull that together to where if you're a physician and you see those, ICS certs that go out or the advisories that go out, how do you react to that? How are you supposed to react? It doesn't mean anything. And so how do we get that messaging more clear and better to the physicians so that they can make informed decisions? And people ask us, we probably the number one question we've gotten since we've been here is, what's your motivation behind this? And simply put is, as I mentioned, we're not financially invested. Nobody's paying us to do this. Man, when we first started this, I remember reading an article about a father talking about his son and what am I supposed to do because he's relying on this for care, for life support, and it really just frustrates us when a vendor has the ability to spend a little bit of money to fix this and do the right thing, and instead they spend more time, trying to control the message. And it's an easy fix, and we demonstrated the security concerns with it. So that's really our motivation, and that's why we're here today. Is they've issued this statements that they're not going to fix these vulnerabilities. They have said they're not patching it. Let's see what happens after our Black Hat talk, right? When the pressure comes on them, I have a feeling they're going to be fixing this thing. I hope so.
I hope so
because it's unfortunate. All right.
So I wish we could on stage exploit their software delivery network and show how you could take over someone's pacemaker remotely. Obviously, we can't do that. So, but what we can do is find a different vulnerability that leverages the same weakness, or a different exploit that leverages the same weakness, and show that. And so that's what we're going to show, right? So, because we already mentioned to you how the delivery mechanism works. There's a VPN. The VPN joins, once you're joined onto the VPN, it authenticates in some specific ways, and then it downloads the update over what? HTTP, right? And then it does what? Runs it, because the software is not signed. So anyone can literally serve back, if they can get the right timing and exploit, whatever, they can actually just serve back an executable and the program is going to run it, right? So that's what we're going to show you. We're going to show you how that works. There's already advisory for this. Essentially, I'm going to kind of describe to you how it works, and then we're going to show you how it works. Essentially what happens is because the actual retrieval mechanism is very insecure over HTTP and unsigned code, they're just strictly relying on that VPN, right, to provide all the security for them. And so if you can convince the programmer that's actually on the VPN when it's not, what happens? It sends an HTTP request to a random server on the internet, basically. And if you can position yourself to say, hey, I'm that server, you should run this executable, that's what the programmer is going to do, right? So we'll show you how to do this if you're on a local network, how you would exploit, what it would look like when this thing gets exploited. And so I don't know if you can switch the screen back to here. Let's see, we'll get this thing set up here. Can you switch to this little camera here? Perfect. All right, so this is the pacemaker programmer interface. And so you can see at the top, if this were actually implanted in someone, you would actually see the pacing occurring up there, right? It'd be feedback from the actual device itself. And so this programmer was going to try to like join a VPN and download software, right? So, but this thing is already exploited. And we want to show you what an exploited programmer looks like, right?
So one of the things we talked about, well, we'll let you.
Second here. All right, so, I mean, you're going to ask a really simple question here. It's like, and then if you look at the answers, right? So, and we've been asked some questions like, Billy, Jonathan, why would you do that, right? And it's like, when you read that advisory, and I recommend everyone go read the advisory for this. When you read the advisory, we'll show you some language from the advisory. It's almost impossible to understand what the real risks are, right? But I think when you see this, you start to understand what the risks are, right? And if you realize that this thing programs these things, maybe it makes a little bit more sense, right? So that's why we did this. We had another thing that we were going to do, but
yeah, we got talked about. One of the problems is with the pacemaker, it's difficult to see our code running on this, all right? Because we can hold it up and say our code's on here. This gives a better display of that. We had actually were coordinating with Black Hat. We were going to bring a pig on stage and shock the pig, but we kind of cooler heads, smarter heads prevailed. Primarily, we didn't know what we were going to do with the carcass afterwards, the livestock carcass here. So we decided to go this route instead. So, but we have demonstrated the ability to actually just change the code to initiate shock when we want. And there's two pieces of this. One is the sensationalism of we could just shock it when we want. That's concerning, right? But actually preventing the shock is another, probably more damaging, right? Because then if you, from a standpoint of you need that therapy, and that therapy is not there for you.
Definitely. Yeah. So that's the road exploit there. We want to
live demo work.
Yeah,
work, right?
Both of them work.
We're going to the craft stable.
Yeah,
so
right.
Thanks.
Measuring risk, right?
Yeah. Google Drive.
Right, yeah.
Measuring risk of Google Drive.
All right, can we go back to the slides if we could? Awesome, perfect. Yeah. All right, so a couple different things here. Right, let me go here and click in. All right, so if you're going to use something like CVSS, which for some reason this vendor was like, oh, the CVSS score is really low, right? So we want to make sure that that's not an appropriate way to measure patient safety risk, right? So example, CVE 2015-3965, that's research that we're involved with. That was a Hospira Symbic infusion pump. If you look at the advisory for that, that has a CVSS score of 7.1. Pretty respectable score, right? So we also did some other research on something called a Pyxis supply cabinet. The Pyxis supply cabinet essentially holds supplies, right? And so that actually has a score of 9.7. If you look at the technical details, vulnerability is actually really, really similar. So, but that one score that has a 7.1, that could be used to kill someone. And the one that's a 9.7 can be used to steal supplies, right? So CVSS really falls down when you're trying to understand patient safety implications and things like that. So here's a system that considers effects. Want to go over this?
Yeah, so we actually, working with some vendors, this was their frustration too, because they want to measure actual risk and they have to report that up in certain situations. And so we kind of came up with this, just a risk scoring system. It's at, you can go check it out and punch in things as you want. And it actually considers the impact to patient health.
Right.
And so you're actually putting it in the context of what does this have on impact to patient therapy, the delivery of patient therapy? Is it a diagnosis impact? And so it actually puts those into context. And so when you run these down, you know, the similar implications, you can actually see it'll actually put that into context. And so we like to just kind of point that out as it's important. It's I don't know if we had the website there for that or not. So here's the one, the same two we saw, potential and impact diagnosis versus potential to cause patient safety event, and how it impacts on the severity of that. There it is. Yeah. So that's up and running. Feel free to give us feedback.
Yeah, it's all client side. So if you want to take a look at exactly how that calculation is being done, definitely take a look. Yeah.
All right. So kind of on a closing note, one of the things that we find interesting is Microsoft. If there's a vulnerability in their software delivery network for pushing updates, do you think it's going to take 18 months for them to push a patch or to repro it or patch it? It's probably a couple. Well, you used to work at Microsoft. Yeah. I mean, we used to work at Google. So it's frustrating, and it's interesting, frustrating, however you want to position it. That from our general IT systems, boy, they're the patch systems, and they've got it down. The variant analysis, if you're as a researcher, if you report something to one of these organizations, they're going to put a team on it and do variant analysis that says, okay, what else in our code similar to that is exposed, or is there other products that we're presenting that have similar vulnerabilities that we need to take a care and look at? But when it comes to a device that actually administers patient care, it's 18 months. They just released a memo saying they're not going to fix it. They're actually going to rely on software or the hospitals.
Right. Yeah.
Boy, could you imagine Microsoft saying, "Well, we got a bug, but just put a firewall in."
Yeah, there's this bug in Exchange, but man, it's not remote. It's just over the network.
Yeah.
Right?
So we want the culture to change on that. I think it is moving that way. And again, we work with a lot of vendors, and there are most vendors out there who are trying to do the right thing. And so we don't want to paint a broad brush on that. But it's frustrating, and I think the industry has a long ways to go, especially when we're sitting here. So
definitely. Yeah, I think that's about it. Once again, hey, look, the benefits, probably most cases for most people, probably outweigh the risk, right? So if I go to the craps table and I slip and fall and hit my head and I have to go to the emergency room, I probably want to be connected to a medical device. And I'm a researcher, right? And the bugs, obviously, things are going to have bugs, right? So, but what we can't control is the way that we react and respond to those. So.
All right, so I think we've got time for a couple questions.
Yeah, I think someone from the FDA is here. If there's questions for the FDA. So like we're not going to answer regulatory questions or anything like that, but they're here to talk about that. And if there's any questions about the technical pieces, we'll be happy to answer that. So, thanks for coming, everyone. Appreciate it.
We have one question here. Yep.
So I'm Suzanne Schwartz from the FDA, and I first of all want to applaud the work that you've done. Billy and Jonathan, you've been really extraordinary partners for the FDA in moving and advancing the state of cybersecurity. I think that this case is illustrative of the need for greater partnership and greater work across the independent security research community and the medical device community and government as well. So we want to encourage that kind of partnership. And we also are very excited about the prospects of standing up the SIMSAB that you highlighted in this slide presentation. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, appreciate that.
And as we mentioned, we know as researchers, sometimes working with regulatory bodies isn't always easy, but to FDA's credit, they've got a lot of challenges, but they've, I appreciate they're working with us. So, any other questions? I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
I'm actually here as a mom. I saw in your abstract that one of the devices you were looking at was a neurostimulator.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I know you didn't have time to get to that because you were irritated with Medtronics, and I understand that. Can you reassure me that Nuvectra is responsive?
Yeah, so we don't have enough time to cover everything that we looked at. There's actually a DHS advisory on some of the issues that we discovered in a neurostimulator programmer. And we also have a deep brain stimulator programmer as well. And we have an Activa PC. So I'm sure if you're interested in specifically that stuff, we can maybe chat with you afterwards about what we've seen in the neurostimulator world.
Okay.
For those that don't know, the neurostimulators work very closely like a pacemaker. It's an implanted device, but instead of connecting to your heart, it connects to your brain or your spine. So and the delivery mechanism essentially stimulates your brain or spine to alleviate pain and things like that. We've looked at some of those systems. We wanted to present some of that here, we just don't have enough time. So.
if there's any more questions. All right. Well, thank you all for attending.
Yeah.
I appreciate your attention.